Oh, okay. Hi, I'm glad that everybody was able to come tonight for this presentation. We're really looking forward to it. My name is Lee. I'm with the Massapequa Public Library, and we wanted to give the community something about Native American heritage, something that at this important time of year. So we're very happy that Chenae Bullock could do this presentation for us. And we're really looking forward to it. So we give the floor to Chenae. Thanks again.
Tabutne in our language means thank you. So thank you so much for having me. It really is an honor to actually be able to present for the Massapequa Library, Massapequa being on Massapequa lands, which was one of our sister tribes in Long Island. It definitely means a lot, as I'm Shinnecock, as you had mentioned. And I'm not going to take too much time doing too much talk before the presentation. If you all don't mind, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the presentation because a lot of stuff I want to talk about is right into that. So I'm going to share my screen here and play from the start. Hopefully you all can see it. Yes, so this presentation is called Native American Heritage Month. We are still here. I like this topic because I think it's imperative that we're not always looked at in a past tense, or we're no longer being looked at in a past tense. We're looked at as people that still exist. Here is an awesome photo of myself, as well as our tribal chairman, Brian Polite, standing directly behind me, as well as some of our tribal members, as we were actually opening up the New York City Cannabis Parade this year. So we were just doing a land acknowledgement there, right on Broadway in close to Times Square. So I'm gonna click through here. So I actually own Moxie2 Consulting. Moxie2 Consulting, it was founded in 2019, and Moxie2 in our language means medicine. So you all could just go visit it, website moxie2consulting.com, and learn a little bit more. But some of the things that we do is we provide cultural and heritage consulting services that help others understand the importance of cultural and heritage preservation. So that's a little bit about the company that I have. Who am I? I am a woman of the Shinnecock Nation. This seal right here is our tribal seal. As you all may know, I'm sure, know that the Shinnecock are a federally recognized tribe that is located on Long Island. However, there have been a number of tribes in Long Island, and there still are a number of tribes in Long Island. And I think it's imperative that as we are in Native American Heritage Month, for those that may not know, that we not only think about, the history, but we think about the resilience that indigenous people have gone through. And so we'll get into a little bit of that in the presentation. But I want to also get into talking about our sister tribes. We're getting ready to go into, and I'll get into it just a little later. Next week, everybody's going to talk about Thanksgiving. So I'm going to do a little demystifying of Thanksgiving in this presentation here. But these are our sister tribes, essentially. You have the Mohegan, the Pequot, the Nahagansett, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, the Massachusetts. These are communities that we have always been interrelated with, to. And we have traveled across what we call the pond, or the Long Island Sound, to trade, to intermarry, to go to ceremonies, and just keep our relationship with our sister tribes. And so we speak very similar languages. A lot of our cultural practices are extremely similar, and we never put borders between any of these states. So now we're kind of confined to some, not confined, but the classifications or categories in which we are in as far as the state is concerned, or the federal government sometimes, is based upon the state in which the tribe is surrounded by. So I just wanted to show you this this photo. here. But the next one that I think is really important is, if you all get a chance, you can go to www.nativeland.ca, and you can type in anywhere, almost I think in the world, but really anywhere into the search, and it'll tell you the territories and the languages and sometimes treaties in which the area is. And I love this particular map because if you really look at it, a lot of these areas in which tribal names are listed are still listed as cities and towns. Massapequa Library, if you were to Google it, right here where it says Massapequa, that's where the library is located. The same thing with Setauket, and Cutchogue, and even Canarsie. These are in Rockaway. These are areas in which these tribes have always lived in, and I think it's important for people to really think about that, and not only just here on Long Island, but anywhere you travel in the world, but really here on Turtle Island, which we call Turtle Island, the United States, Canada, and South America, because we never put borders there. So that's just a little bit of foundational land acknowledgement, if you will, opening to this presentation here. But I really want to talk about, we can get it, I like to do like a past, present, and maybe some sort of future. We're just kind of roll the past into now. So talking about those place names and those tribal names, it's also imperative for us to think about the genetic relation that we've had to the land and the water. This painting here is a painting that was done by David Martin Bund, who is a Shinnecock historian. He was also the director of our tribal museum at one point, but he's an amazing artist. And this artist, this painting here is a beautiful image of what it really looked like in the times prior to contact, from the clothing, the shellfish, as you can see, and as you can see the way they are dressed, and the different things that are in this photo is that they harvested with the seasons. Like we said, our genetic relation to the land and the water, this time of year is that time of harvest, the time where you're beginning to start to prepare your meat and smoke your meat and get all the things that you need for the winter time, and dried berries, dried fruits, dried vegetables, and you can store those, and so they're preserved, and you can use them throughout the winter time. And so that's what really this time of year really was, when we talk about harvesting. And then we were semi-nomadic. We were very free to travel from one side of the pond to the other side of the pond, so to speak, or one side of Long Island Sound to the other side of Long Island Sound. And so, Long Island now is extremely, I will say, the landmass has, we've lost a lot of our landmass in regards to climate change over the last 400 years. But at that time, it's safe to say that we had more of a shelf life. So you actually were seeing more homes located around some of the waterways. And then in the wintertime, we moved about 8 to 10 miles inland. So we would be underneath the old growth forests. Unfortunately, some of those old growth forests in Long Island are very scarce. So that's kind of how we were able to move. And then, of course, we traveled the world by carbon neutral vessels or machoons. And in these machoons, carried a lot of messages, carried a lot of trade goods. Some of these areas in that we know, like the World Trade Center, for example, these were areas that we had already been trading in. Shellfish is still a very huge, vital part of our traditions and who we are. Not only just like our traditions, but like literally it is who we are as a people. We are people of the Stony Shore in Shinnecock. Long Island at one point had been known from our sister tribes surrounding Long Island as C1 which was the island of shells. And so we traded shellfish in Long Island for a lot of beaver furs and bear furs and wolf furs and, like very, very thick, heavier coats of furs, as those that were in the north, those animals were a lot thicker as far as the fur, as the pelts were concerned. So we would trade with them. And so that's kind of what I say as far as our genetic relation to the land and water, because this is who we are by genetics. I mean, you put someone of Shinnecock in 2021, let's say, who has never actually been has never paddled before, but because their genetic makeup it's very simple and almost like super easy for them, as opposed to someone else that just never has been able to have that within their family heritage. So the genetic relation that we have, it's a very natural and organic, like biocentric way of living on the earth. And we're doing everything we can to kind of get back to those ways. Because unfortunately, we get into, let me just see if I have something on here. Okay. We get into the topic of broken treaties. When the settlers came here, and it's so hard to do these webinars because I like to say, well, raise your hand if you know what this is. I'd like to do a lot of interacting sometimes when I'm doing these presentations, because this is a lot to take in. So I'm not sure if many of you that are familiar with this military strategic plan. This is considered military intelligence, if you will. If you move it back to 2021, right, or at times of today, something like this would have been very classified information at the time, right? But this was a map that really we began to see our treaties be broken. This was the plan and tactic for the Pequot War in 1634. We do know that Massasoit, who was also known as Osamequin to our people, which means yellow feather, out in out in Bristol, Rhode Island, and Pokanoket territory, which is where Massasoit essentially lived. He traveled out to Plymouth, which is Patuxent lands, in 1621. And around that time, there was a peace treaty that was meant to be had. And that was that the English would not fire upon the natives, and the natives would not fire upon the English. And if you look very closely at this diagram that was drafted in about 1634, you also began to see that those treaties are now broken. This is a diagram of the inner circle being the palisade located in what is known now as Mystic River Seaport, right across from Mystic River Seaport on that hill there, was considered Noank, which was one of the home sites of about 700 to 800 women and children. Now, why am I talking about the Pequot War? And this really has nothing to do with Long Island and all that. It does, because the Pequots were essentially, like I showed you in the map earlier, were sister tribes. As a matter of fact, Sassacus, who was the chief of this nation at the time, the reason why this started is because his cousin Uncas was very upset that he did not become chief. And so Uncas decided to work closely with the English, because he knew that the English wanted to get rid of the Pequots, because the Pequots were growing strong. They had upper hand in the trade waterways, and it was really causing interference for the English, as they were hoping to push further west of Connecticut, as close as they could to the Dutch border, because you had New England and then you had New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam being like New York, but Long Island not yet being conquered. So these treaties that were made were essentially broken, because Uncas brought the English into a home site and a home village of almost 800 Pequot women, men, elders, and children. And they worked closely with the Narragansetts, says the Narragansetts wanted gunpowder, and they slaughtered and massacred that. And so that this is essentially known as the Pequot Massacre or the Pequot War. And so that's when you begin to see these treaties broken. Massasoit's Treaty obviously being broken. King Philip's War happened later, but this was kind of the start of us as indigenous people in these northeastern homelands, seeing that they don't mean what they say on paper, and they don't mean what they say when they shake your hand or look in your eyes. They will break these treaties, and not only will they break these treaties, they will genocide your people. And this map right here, or this diagram, was really the tactic. This was drawn out by two gentlemen, one named Captain John Underhill and the other named Captain John Mason. Now, how does that tie into Long Island? This became their resume builder. This is what got them more jobs of annihilating indigenous peoples, and specifically in the massive Pequot area, and even through the areas of Canarsie. And there is a street in Brooklyn called Underhill Street, and that is named after John Underhill. He was well known for going up into the Wappiner and the other tribes, of really getting rid of those communities, because he had this tactic on how to do so. And the other colonists looked at him as the man to call to get that job done. And so that was his career path for the next 50 years. The Pequot War, again, I think I gave a little bit of things there. But here are some of the things that were said. The Pequots shall be divided as foresaid and shall no longer be called Pequots. And so that right there was actually considered the Treaty of Hartford. That was written right in 1636. And that is really where you began to see any people that were left as the Pequot's descendants, or people that survived that war, were automatically put into slavery across the water somewhere else, or on our own homelands, forced into indentured servitude. The first slave trade began between North America and the Caribbean. And again, that really started right after the Pequot War, right? So 1634, 1636, you fast forward to December of 1638, a slave ship named Desire was brought into the Boston harbor, and the shipment had a shipment of slaves from Barbados. Now, Barbados is interesting too, right? Because when you really look at Long Island and you look at that area between, I don't know my audience that well, so I don't know who's a history buff like I am, but if you're taking notes, this is cool. Google it later. There is an area called Shelter Island. Nathaniel Sylvester purchased Shelter Island from the Earl of Stirling, James Ferret, at the time in 1634, right? So think about everything that just happened. Our ancestors were slaughtered. Land had been stolen, because if you're the Earl of Stirling selling land that you never actually is yours, you stole that land and made a profit off of it to other people like Nathaniel Sylvester. Now you have slave ships coming directly from Barbados. Nathaniel Sylvester was one of the most wealthy plantation owners in Barbados. I'm just putting it all together for you all. And then by 1641, Massachusetts Bay Colony was the first of Britain's mainland colonies to make slavery legal. And so that makes Governor John Winthrop the first governor out of Massachusetts Bay Colony, being able to write the first law on US soil, really officially sanctioning the practice of keeping African slaves. So just like, I like to bring this up into the conversation, because this is a really intricate history between African slaves, Caribbean slaves, and Native American slaves. And oftentimes we don't realize that all of them were put into slavery, sometimes on the same ships. The transaction in the Americas would be for African slaves and rum. And then when they came here, it would be for rum, maybe Caribbean slaves and natives and lumber, because it really wasn't money all the time, it was trade. And so this was considered the slave trade. And then, the times in which that they do this in, it was all based upon the currents of the Atlantic Ocean. So all of that we just talked about, why does this have to do with Thanksgiving? Well, we saw the Pequot War diagram, 1634, and then we saw the Treaty of Hartford in 1636, and now in 1637, you begin to see that William Bradford being the governor of Plymouth, this is the first and only place that you actually see the word Thanksgiving at any of this time, that they talked about having natives and pilgrims sitting down and eating. The first place that you actually ever see this on is a proclamation that Governor William Bradford in 1637, he wrote, the 12th of the 8th month was ordered to be kept as a day of public thanksgiving to God for his great mercies and the subduing of the Pequots, bringing the soldiers in safely. So we understand what subduing means, and they were giving thanks for that, of the Pequot massacre, a year later in November, around the time that everybody celebrates Thanksgiving. So right there, in a nutshell, there's your truth of Thanksgiving on paper. That's the first place, like historically, that we see it, and that's what this is right here. And that's pretty much what that is. Now we go back to Captain John Underhill. Captain John Underhill, his resume was like just going after there. So the Keith Wars actually took place right in like the Long Island Sound, towards like the Bronx and the Wappinger area. And that's really what was taking place out there. And so Captain John Underhill was actually commissioned and hired to do away with some of those other villages surrounding those lands. And so every single time that they would massacre a village, they would actually have a day of Thanksgiving. And so this happened up until George Washington literally became president, because this was like a tradition that people were doing every time they would go and raid or kill or slaughter indigenous communities. They would have a celebration afterwards, like an actual celebration where they have feasts, they have food, they had forced sexual entertainment by our ancestral women, things like that. And so this was something that was taking place all throughout Long Island, with the exception of where we are in the Shinnecock territories, because those treaties were a lot different than you saw throughout the rest of Long Island. And so that happened up until when George Washington, he had enough of it. He thought it just became disgusting. And he said, so we're going to do this once a year. And that's going to be on November 26th. And so he wrote a proclamation on November 26th, 1789, to actually have a day of public Thanksgiving once a year. And then the change of how people began to view Thanksgiving really came through Abraham Lincoln and his proclamation. And that was really because he wanted to restore the country in regards to all the wars that were happening. So he wanted to actually help the homeless and give back and feed and help to build homes and stuff. So that was really about giving thanks then. But where the history really came from, the other parts of that is not what you hear in any of your history books. You have to actually be able to somewhat read these firsthand written accounts to get the real truth. And that's why I have this on here. So forced assimilation. So let's say Captain John Underhill became so successful. He made a lot of money. He traveled. He held his public days of Thanksgiving throughout Long Island. Proclamations and things were made and all of that. And so now you have less You have a very short, small percentage of Native Americans left, that you have shipped some of the strongest ones out into slavery. You have killed some of the strongest ones, such as King Philip. You've put his head on a massacre. Same thing with Weetamo. And now you have who you have left. You have created laws against our way of living. These things began to happen, and so forced assimilation happens. So this picture looks very different from the photos that I showed earlier, or the image, the painting that I showed earlier of our beautiful ancestors on our homelands. But this is also one of my favorite photos, because at the very bottom, you see the script that says the last of the Shinnecock Indians, LINY 1884. Now, that's the big topic about paper genocide, because if these were the last Shinnecocks, then I'm a fraud, or I'm not alive. I'm a Shinnecock. My mom is Shinnecock through and through, and so forth and so forth and so forth and so forth. So the forced assimilation, you begin to see the men have short hair, the women hair is groomed, they're covered from the neck to their ankle. They're obviously not smiling. They don't look, happy and prosperous. There's forced assimilation. There's a kill the Indian, save the man, so to speak. And children were often put into indentured servitude, because in order for us to be able to enter in, let me see, I can change this here. In order for us to be able to enter in any kind of industry, right? Or even build a house, right? We came from a people that didn't have monetary money. And if laws began to be made against our way of living, how do we purchase nails for a house? How do we purchase lumber for a house? And if we never needed that, and we could just go into the woods and go into the cedar swamps and gather cedar saplings and wait for the bark and the sap to run so we could peel it off and make bark for our covered homes, or go get cattail reeds. And if that became illegal for us to forage and hunt and do all of those kind of things, we had to purchase nails, we had to purchase milk, we had to do all those things. But if we didn't have the money, what was it that we had to give up? Our children. There were agreements that they would take our children at the age of 5 or maybe 3 and return the child when they're 21 years old. And so all of the work that the family, all of the things that the family needed to build their homestead was through the payment of their child. And then once that indentured servitude ended, boarding schools and residential schools began. So there was like this never ending thing that was beginning to happen. So you have a lot of these type of things. And then going back to the genetic relation to the land and water, we were forced to lease our land and to sell our land. And when that happens, the neglect of the stewardship of the land, we were forced to stop controlled burns. Controlled burns, I'm sure many of you all know, are very, 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 very helpful for our environment, right? And since we had to stop doing it, look at our environment now. You have briars that grow through the woods. We used to be able to just run straight through the old growth forest without ever hitting anything. Now you can't do that. The same thing with hunting and fishing and shellfishing. If you don't shellfish in an area, the area can get very murky and unshellfishable. But if you now are forced to have permits and you can't afford them, then it's just, that's what began to happen. And so you began to see that in that time period with the laws against our way of living. And of course, the residential schools, like I mentioned. Just a really quick note, September 30th of this year, Canada actually deemed that day as a day of remembrance. And a lot of people wore the color orange, Orange T-shirt Day, in memory of the children that died. This is a picture of the Carlisle Indian School I don't know if you can't really see directly behind it, but there was a railroad that went directly through that school. And most of the railroads were built on Indian territory. As you can see, when you come out to the Hamptons, there is a railroad that goes straight through one of our burial sites. And our children were put on those trains and they were all shipped off to Carlisle Indian School. Pretty much all of the schools east of the Mississippi, I mean, all of the reservations east of the Mississippi, their children somehow ended up in this school. And not all of them came out alive. This year, there was an unearthing of mass burial graves behind a lot of these residential schools. So there's a big movement happening now in Indian country for us, one, to honor and remember those little children that didn't get to have, you know, the privileges that we all have as people here in this country. But there's also survivors that came through those schools that witnessed and experienced those horrific things. And we honor them as well. So there's the residential schools. And then moving into like the awesome movement of the 60s, right? I love to say I love this movement because, especially if you look at this photo is so diverse. You know, a lot of people say the rainbow movement. I mean, you see African American, you see Asian, you see Native American, you see white, Hispanic, men, women, all different groups of people in this. And this is a photo that was taken during the first National Day of Mourn protest in 1978, or it was like 1976. My uncles and aunts from Shinnecock, who are relatives, once again, like I was saying, to our relatives out there in Mashpee and Massachusetts and Nipmuc, they all went and they protested, and some of them are in this photo. And it's really cool because what we're seeing is something that we're beginning to see again in Indian country. And as young people, we're kind of doing it a little different, maybe through graphics, maybe through these kind of cool PowerPoints. But nonetheless, this was like the plight of Indian country, right? These were some of the kids that either ran away from those residential schools, have cousins or relatives or brothers or sisters that didn't survive through those residential schools. You know, they are also people that, you know, started a movement to protect our indigenous sovereign rights. And so this really kicked off the plight of Indian country because there was a foot on our back, as you could see in previous slides, what that prevented us from doing. And so during this time period, you began to see people kind of rising up in that, and that kind of hasn't changed, right? Because the fight continues. Here's a picture of, indigenous people at Standing Rock. I gave up about 6 months of my life, and I was called out to Standing Rock, and I stayed out there, lived out there for about 6 months. And I did that, one, because our relatives, the Humpapa people, they called on every human to come and stand with them, not just the tribes, not just natives, because what they were fighting for was the Missouri River. And that Missouri River is water for over 18 million people in this country. And that water also flows into the Gulf of Mexico. And the Gulf of Mexico essentially has a Gulf Stream that shoots right up to the shores of Shinnecock. So it was my responsibility and inherent obligation to stand with them. So that's what we did. But there's so many other movements that people are standing up against. And so you see that same spirit that you saw in the previous picture right here in this photo. And here are some of the current movements. You know, if you want to write down, you have MMIW, which is Missing Murdered Indigenous Women, hashtag Land Back. You're probably seeing a lot of that happen throughout Long Island. And then reclaiming our economic power. That's something that I'm really big and focused on. And, you know, I do wear a business hat for my tribe, really trying to help get our tribes to be economically sustainable, as we don't really receive all the funds that we need from the state or even sometimes the government. And we still have to maintain ourselves, as we still have laws against our way of living. And how can we now pay for lumber And how can we now pay for those nails? Well, we're not giving our children over, but we've got to be able to have some sort of income to be able to do that. So reclaiming our economic power. And of course, having a seat at the table. Yes, I'm Native, I'm very traditional, but I'm also an intellectual. I'm also a businesswoman. And, we do have scientists, we do have environmentalists, we do have professors, we have teachers, we have artists. And we are also leaders in these places, and sitting at the table equally is what's really going to help all of us be able to restore this earth. And so right there, you see me speaking at the Columbia Law School Earth Institute for a managed retreat conference that was held in 2019. And then sitting right beside me is Siobhan Smith, who is our environmental director for the Shinnecock department. And she has developed something called the Shinnecock Climate Change Adaptation Plan. And so having a seat at the table with policymakers and things like that is important, because we have knowledge of these lands that date way past a computer or way past a pen and paper. And so we're stewards of this land, and it's going to take all of us to sit down together to talk about it. Of course, our coastal resurgence is something that we are really proud of and doing. Here's a photo that was actually taken right by the Mystic Seaport, as I was telling you all, where the Pequot massacre was had. Well, it happened like right behind these houses, to be honest. That's exactly where the massacre was. And so you can imagine the spirit of our ancestors as we are paddling in this long machine that hadn't been built in over 400 years in an area that is now developed on, that once was massacred. So there's a coastal resurgence of our canoe culture coming back. And of course, there are different ways for us to be able to help people have better insight on, getting connected to the earth and the environment. So I have an ebook that is available for purchase. You can go right to my website, www.moxie2consulting.com, and the ebook is there. It is in the process of having a second edition that will be print. Here are just some of the plants that are in the book there for all you plant nerds like me. But I talk about these plants from the indigenous perspective. So as you can hear how I kind of talk about history, this is exactly a way that I talk about, the plants that are listed in the book. I will say that one of the plants that actually inspired me to write this book is the eelgrass, because the eelgrass actually grows around Shinnecock, but it's also an endangered species, but it also is a medicine plant because it protects our coastal areas. And the more and more that they are harmed, the more and more we become harmed because we do not have protection from them. There are so many sea turtles that come up and lay their eggs in there. There are also crabs that lay their eggs in there. And all of it's all a part of the Earth's ecosystem. And if we don't have the proper plants around there, then, we're just breaking it. So I get into a little conversation about that. That's just one plant. But yeah. And then our future, right? This is what we're all doing it for, right? I think every single person on this earth, we have the cutest little babies, all of us, right? And, their bright eyes and their intuitiveness and their eagerness to learn. But one of the beautiful things is seeing them actually just take leadership within our own community at such a young age shows us how bright our future is. But it also holds us accountable too, These are children that are going to the school of Southampton, whose parents went to the school of Southampton, whose parents before them, before there was even a school of Southampton, right? So they're literally living in the same areas that their ancestors lived in. And there's a spiritual connection that they have to that. But our job is to make sure that they can maintain that connection. But in order to do that, we have to make sure that we are all working together for our children and our future. And so how you can get in contact with me, just some more information. You can follow me on Instagram. You can visit the website, as I mentioned, or you can also contact me at info@Moxie2 Consulting. It's supposed to say .com. And that's the presentation. So I hope I wasn't too long-winded. I hope you all enjoyed it.
It was an amazing presentation, very, very educational and informative. This recording that is being made, is that going to be available to the public?
Yeah, sure. And if people don't want this question and answer session on it, I can kind of extract that off at the end too. So it will be available. I mean, if it will be available to the public if Chenae is okay for it to be available to the public, I guess.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
I mentioned last week, and we had a lecture in another library with Jeremy Dennis and his mother, Denise, from the Shinnecock Nation, that my cousin has been the reading specialist for for 5 states out west. She lived in Valentine, Nebraska for about 30 years. Now she's in South Dakota. For the Indian peoples out there, the Native peoples out there, and the South Dakota University, I think they call them Wizardpan, Wizipan, Wizardpan. She's been the reading coordinator, reading specialist for 5 different states. I'm wondering, and this is something that just occurred to me during your lecture, do the Indian people resent the fact that they have outsiders coming in as reading specialists? Or is it appreciated, or is it resented?
I think that's an amazing question. I'm gonna be very truthful.
I hope I want you to be. Yeah.
Yeah, listen. I don't know how to be any other way, right? I will say that I cannot answer that question for all Indians, right? Because you ask the question, do the Indians think? I can't answer it for all Indians. I can say that it's like a half and half. A lot of people want to finally be heard. A lot of people want to be the ones that give these presentations. They want to be the ones that tell the story. They want to be at the table as an equal, as a leader. And for a long time, it's not ever been that. And so you've kind of always had an expert telling us about us. We had to sit in schools that they talked to us about us. And however, I think it really depends upon the relationship that individual is having with the community, that they receive them in the way of, okay, she's helping us in something that we need. I think it just really all depends,
From the pictures that she sends me on Facebook, it seems that she's much loved by the whole community. She's been there almost 40 years already.
Right.
And much loved.
Yeah.
I had another question, which I've forgotten already.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the question was, did they take the children from the age of 3 because they wanted to Christianize them, to change them, to essentially make them lose their culture and their tradition and their customs? Why did they take the children at the age of 3 and put them in schools and take them away from the parents?
Well, I can definitely say that no, they did not look at us as equal humans. So they're not seeing it as cute little children like we see it, right? As I think most of us should be able to see that. There's many different reasons. One, you had King Philip, who was Massasoit's son, who witnessed the Pequot War. They witnessed all these things. And they began to see that most of the heavy, full-on indentured servitude really super began to happen like right after the King Philip's War, because they made a mistake of not really forcing so many of a whole diaspora of people into indentured servitude or slavery, because they just overlooked that. And so when you have a child that was 3 and 5 and 6 and witnessed the slaughter of their parents, of their aunts and of their uncles, and then they become 21 years old, and now they're a leader, they are a warrior, the English they feared that uprising. So by taking the child immediately and forcing them to unlearn everything that they know about, I mean, I literally have firsthand written accounts from like 9-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 10-year-olds of my ancestors, of like them writing while they were in those places, of what that experience was like. And they apologized of like saying, I was having dreams about fishing with my uncle and paddling here. And I realized that these thoughts are demonic and things like that. And so what they were doing was
erasing their whole history from their mind.
And right. And so by the time you're 21 years old, you look like the people that I showed you in the portrait of all of the last Shinnecocks.
Yeah.
That's pretty much, that's the concept. And that became the example. And so now look, I have a good little Indian. They can travel, they can be a spy, they will tell on people.
Yeah, it's out and out brainwashing.
Right. So I mean, I can't exactly answer the biggest question as to why they did that, but in my mind, like just doing my interpretation of a lot of the research that I've done, I would say that there was a fear of them turning against, right? I mean, because you got to think about it. When the English first came here, they were completely outnumbered. So you have to strategize how to mentally break the strength of a people. And so you do that by taking their children and turning their children into your children, who now they become loyal to you and your people.
Well, now they don't know their own history.
Right. Yeah.
This is why the South is fighting against what they've just named, a whole new name that they never had before, is critical race theory. Mm-hmm. They don't want it taught in the South because they don't want the people to know their history. Right.
You know what though, you do us a big service by showing us these injustices. I mean, we thank you for telling us, and thank you for, it's very sad and very upsetting.
It is. And I hate to say that sometimes, hey, it gets better, and it doesn't, but the resiliency that you can see and some of the awesome things that our tribes are doing gives people a better appreciation, right? Because you can see, like, we have Shinnecock monuments up, there's Indigenous Peoples Day that New York State just essentially recognized. And, now you begin to see all that hard work and fight that has happened all over the years. It's beginning to somewhat pay off. And that I think is a beautiful thing.
We were wondering if you could tell us something about Warriors of the Sunrise.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so Warriors of the Sunrise, and not just Warriors of the Sunrise, but you have had a long history of Shinnecock, and I won't just say Shinnecock, but Indigenous people of Long Island, who have fought with their bodies, literally put their lives on the line, to protect our ancestral burial sites, which are in the Shinnecock Hills. And the Shinnecock Hills is considered like the highest point of that area, because that's where we buried our ancestors. And the desecration that has been happening over the years has just been like the worst. And so you have had just that. You have had warriors that watch for those hills at all times to see, and just to make sure that there's protection. And so they call themselves the Warriors of the Sunrise. But we also have a group that's called Graves Protection Warrior Society. And that is, doesn't quite go, I don't want to say hand in hand, but very similar people that are on both of those fight for very similar injustices. But the Warriors of Sunrise doesn't just focus on just the Graves protection, but they do focus on the things that are happening on what is most people say Sunrise Highway, if you will. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I wanted to tell you how grateful I am that you came, how really grateful I am, and how much I've learned. I've been following to a limited extent and have traveled in the West, and went to some reservations, which I had very mixed feelings about going to, but in any case, just wanted to say that from what I read, Canada has apologized formally and officially to the Native Americans of Canada for taking their children away. And I just wish that we could do that here too, because it's symbolic, it's terribly late, the harm is done, but it would, to me, it would mean a lot if we could do that.
Yes, that was the day that I was talking about, September 30th of this year. Canada has actually made that an official day of remembrance. And so the United States has not, but that didn't stop the people of the United States from coming together in solidarity. And I think, like, you know, when people talk about being an American or living here in the Americas, like, I think all of us have to, one, acknowledge the wrongs and take a step in making things right. So it can't just be, this is just an indigenous issue. Like, no, this is the legit foundation of this country. And until we can fix those things, then how are we all going to move forward together? And
it has to be acknowledged. It has to be acknowledged in the whole country. And the problem here, I'm not from America, but the problem I see is that we have so many regions and so many political pockets, and it's not one country. If you go to a European country, it's oftentimes a single country with a certain ability to legislate. You know, here, there's no way to legislate that this history should be taught everywhere, that Native American history should be taught in every school, everywhere. But we can't do that. Our hands are tied because of the multiplicity of the country.
Well, I mean, to a degree, we can't forget that tribes are nations. So we can't forget that we have governmental power. We're not just regular US citizens beating our chest and protesting. There is sovereignty that we actually can assert. Now, what happens is if people begin to support and work with those tribal communities and those tribal nations, then that can actually make and create change on the larger scale, which is a federal scale, like on a national scale. But if people are, you know, and it just takes conversations, it takes more lectures and presentations like this to just get more and more people aware of some of these different types of things. And the more people are aware as they begin to vote on something, like, you know, I mean, not jumping too deep off into the weeds here, but when people are advocate about human rights and they're advocates for environmental rights and these kind of things, when you look at presidential debates, Natives know when they talk about us on some of these concerns, but none of the questions are concerning Native people ever. No. And that is also because the people shape these questions, right? You have a lot of people that advocate for Black and white issues, and the people shape it so much that those questions that are in a debate are based upon the Black and white issues, or based upon what's happening in the school system, based upon the health disparities. If people are not educated enough to know what's happening with Indigenous peoples, then how can they help to shape some of these questions that also push, you know, hold our leadership accountable? Today was the first day of the entire week for the White House Native Tribal Nations Summit. And today, I think one of the executive orders that President Joe Biden actually signed today in the Tribal Nation Summit was regarding the protection of Native peoples because of our missing, murdered, and Indigenous women. Now that took a lot of movement from all of us, right? I showed that to you in the presentation, MMIW, and more people got to hear and know about missing, murdered Indigenous women. They start to bring that into their you know, they might advocate for libraries to have books on these kind of things. They might advocate for their local governments to have different types of things. And now look at that, the executive order was signed today.
Oh my goodness.
So that says a lot about how people can really come together to make change. And once we do that, if you're protecting the women of a community, you're actually investing in the future of a community, you know?
Why didn't the media publicize what he did today instead of taking up all the time on polls again about his popularity?
Well, that's probably because you're not gonna have, I mean, I can't quite answer that question, but you really think about it, like we don't really have a voice in media, Native people, right? That took place in a private leadership summit that he had with tribal people. I listened in because I had access to listen in. And so that's how I knew about it.
Yeah, he got the infrastructure thing.
Excuse
He
me?
got the infrastructure thing done today. He
Yeah,
did this, what you just said today. And
Yeah.
all they're publicizing is his popularity numbers. Maybe
No.
if they publicized what he's gotten done, his popularity numbers would go up.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know. I don't really look at certain types of media. I look at real media, like Indians.com published it, Indian Country Today published it.
But it has to go out across the world to at least the United States to
Well, maybe you can
raise
write to
people's
them.
awareness, raise people's awareness that this was an issue that
Right.
finally there was some progress made.
Right. Maybe you can write to them and say that, you know, you'd like to see more Native news, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah, they all listen to me.
Chenae, Jews who survived the Holocaust, there's still some survivors left, and then there are their children. And many of them go into schools and they present very bravely
Hmm.
their memories, recollections in the camps and so on. And I wondered if do Native Americans who had gone to some of these schools, these horrific schools. When I visited, I don't even want to talk about what I heard, but anyway, do Native Americans go into regular public schools or private schools and make presentations for kids or in colleges for history classes, or is there any kind of a program to bring it to everyone's attention?
You're talking about survivors or just Native Americans in general?
Both. And you know what? Both, actually, either. I mean, yeah.
I mean, I'm doing it right now in my
Yeah, you are. But is it happening on a larger scale? Is there
I mean,
other?
I also had a photo of me speaking at Columbia Law Institute.
Yes,
I don't know
yes,
how big you can get after that, but
Yes. That's fantastic. I'm just thinking you should be like distributed all over the country is what I mean.
I think it is. I think it is. I think people just have this expectation that we're just going to be mainstream like everybody else. But the fact of the matter is, like, there's this huge demand for us. But I think what people need to realize is, and they need to look into our world first, versus, I don't see you here. I don't see you here. I don't see it here. I don't see it here. Maybe go into Indian country and see what's happening, and to realize, like, I showed you a picture of what took place in 1974. And then I showed you a picture of what took place in 2017. And you can see the same thing, but more Indian people.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, of course we're in Indians. Well, of course we're in schools. Of course we're doing, I mean, I own a consulting firm. You know, there's so many things that we're doing. I think that people need to start coming to us, seeing what we're doing and seeing what it is that's needed, versus us, you know, trying to beat our chest and scream to the top of our lungs just to be heard. I mean, we've been here, we're on a level of surviving on so many different levels. I mean, our land is legit still being stolen. We're still being pulled into court because we're putting a billboard up on our own land, you know, and people are still trying to steal our children. So these are things that, like, we're having to fight for existence for. So not everybody might have time to go into a school because we're trying to survive. But at the same time, I think it's imperative to see the work that we are doing. And so, yeah, I mean, I have a consulting firm. We are in those schools now. As far as your survivors, I'm not going to force any survivor to talk about their trauma when it's already hard for them.
Of course not. I didn't mean
No.
that.
I mean, you've got some people that are just starting to come out of like therapy on that. You know, a
Mhm.
lot of those Holocaust survivors are a lot older.
That's right.
Some of these survivors are just a little older than me. You know, so some of them, some of the ones from the older boarding schools, there might be some YouTube videos you might be able to catch there of some documentaries and things for just some educational purposes on just to know what they experienced. But I was taught recently by one of my council members that Native people have been hidden for so long that we have began to, unfortunately, that's a comfortable area for us to stay hidden. And when we come out, there's all these questions like, are you a real Pocahontas? Is that a real fire? Do you still live in a teepee? Like all of these crazy, ignorant questions, and not ignorant in this sense that I'm saying that people are like dumb for asking these, but
No.
the conversation of it helps us realize like, wow, we are really a novelty to the world. And so maybe I'll go back into hiding and focus on protecting the earth because that's the real work. Maybe I'll work on protecting the water because that's the real work. And maybe if people come and see us doing that, then the real work of visibility is done. And that's the work that we do. And so putting some of these presentations together to share you all just a small bit. The real job is for you to Google, go research, go make those connections with those tribes, get on that website, type in wherever it is that you're visiting and work and create relationship and stewardship with the tribes. You know what I mean? Because it is a lot on us. You got to think about it. We have millions and millions of people that once lived here, and we're the survivors of 10% that survived. I'm a descendant of the 10% that survived those millions of people. So there's a lot of work that each of us are doing. You know what I mean? So I hope that this presentation was useful and that this recording can hopefully touch others and inspire others to, you know, one, echo our voices, but get to know the indigenous peoples of the homelands in which that you live on.
Have conditions improved with Jeremy showed us a new Shinnecock preschool. He said that was completed in 2015. It looks like a beautiful school. But have general living conditions improved, or is the government still shortchanging everyone?
What do you mean on Shinnecock?
Shinnecock or any other nations that you know in the country. I mean, when my cousin first got to Valentine, Nebraska, she said what the government had done for the people was basically nothing, and she was appalled at the lack of everything.
Well, I think that's what. Yeah, I mean, no, it really. That's why I have reclaim our economic power. Like you cannot. You have to have your own economic power. You have to have your own economic sustainability. And at one point in time, we had that. We didn't need anything. We shellfish. We did all those things that I said. We had a genetic relation to the land and the water.
I know, but this country did that to you.
But you also have to understand that we have a genetic intelligence that can also give us innovative understanding on how to become economically sufficient. So if a tribe or a community can now generate their own revenue to build houses for their own people, to generate solar power, hydropower, electricity for their own people, and possibly service surrounding areas, as well as create holdings companies to generate new businesses and development and create banks that are sovereign, it doesn't matter what the government didn't do because you can do it for yourself. That's what I mean, economic sustainability. When I say that we actually paddled into the modern day World Trade Center, I'm dead serious. I paddled there. I paddled down the upper Hudson and the lower Hudson, and I greeted the Hukalea with Shinnecock tribal youth in an area that we have been trading in for thousands of years. So if any of our people are still dependent upon a government then the mental health of our people has to be healed first. Because if we are going to be dependent upon a government that has never provided for us, then we don't have a future.
That's right.
Now, I have a quick question for you too, if you have a moment. Like,
Sure.
could you speak a little bit about the good work that your consulting firm does? I mean, I'm sure you've been speaking about it for the last few minutes, more or less, but maybe you could share that with us quick if you have it.
Sure. So Moxie2 Consulting, so I've worked in public history. I'm very able to answer all of these questions that you could see, like, all right, boom, where I can answer, I worked in public history for almost 15 years. I worked at Mashantucket Pequot Museum. I worked at Plymouth Plantation. I've worked at our museum. I helped to start our living village when it first was like being built. But then I also worked in corporate America because the public history side didn't pay enough, right? So I was still living in a condition that I didn't want to live in. So we talk about economic sovereignty. So I went to work for, some very big corporations. I had to obviously move out of that area because being a woman of my complexion, you're not really going to get anything but a hospitality or a service job. They don't look at you as a boss. They don't look at you as an executive. They don't see you as anyone of that kind of intelligence in the East. And I'm saying that because I don't see myself in any of those positions. So I ended up moving away and obtaining, different types of jobs. And then I also realized, like, well, this isn't what I want to do. What I really want to do is create my own business and be able to do for my people and create jobs for my people and educate people, but really get people back to the earth. And so understanding the infrastructure of a very high level corporate business is kind of like the model I use to be able to get my business going. So while I was working at Porsche Cars North America in Atlanta, Georgia, I officially launched Moxie2 Consulting. But I have been doing consultant work, for years, just really not, understanding that I need to create it as a business. So Moxie2 Consulting is something that, I do a lot of different types of things. Inquiries such as this, like, giving, virtual lectures, but also doing liaison work, creating curriculum, writing curriculum for school systems, working with film producers and artists to help make sure that they're not culturally appropriating something. There's so many different kinds of services. NAGPRA consultancy. A lot of people don't know what NAGPRA is or Section 106 actually is. And so some of these developers that are doing things don't realize that you might have an Indian at your doorstep fighting you. And you could have prevented that if you understood some of the protocols that the tribes really have in that area. So a lot of times they would hire consulting firms to handle that, but those consulting firms were not Native. So they also didn't know it. So sometimes, like, it causes a lot of riffraff. And I realized, like, well, if the developers are going to develop, they are going to develop. We can't stop them from developing. Well, how can we actually possibly try to figure out a way to work together? So that's kind of like some of the work that Moxie2 Consulting really does, but it really is just getting people back to our environment, and all of these conversations that we really have, it all ties down to that.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's wonderful. That's wonderful work that you do. I mean, so we're indebted to you for providing this to all of our communities, So I was going to say, we're going to do our best to put this video out there, to help share the information that you provided to us to help enlighten people. And we thank you so much for coming down and doing this talk for us. It was really good to hear. I mean, a lot of it was sad, but it's good for people to become enlightened about what has happened in the past and what, and also, like you say, Native peoples are still here. So, I mean, people forget. So it's important that people remember, you know, the whole country. I know you're independent nations,
Mhm.
but we're all one big mosaic.
Yes.
So it's very important for people to remember and to know. And thanks again. We appreciate the talk, and it really was very enlightening too. So
Yes, and thank you so much for having the patience with me and having me on here today. It really means a lot. Like I said, I seen Master Pequot and I was like, oh yeah, of course, definitely. It's a responsibility, you know, so thank you so much. And I did put the link. I know that there was a question for the native land map. It's in here. This would also be something great for Master Pequot Public Library to just have as a reference for anybody that they might come in from Ohio or wherever and they don't know what native land they're on. They click right on that map and they could type it right in there. And so I put the link here in the chat.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
thanks again. A lot of positive comments too, and a lot of people in chat have been saying what a great presentation it was too.
Yes, this was really awesome. And I thank you all for your awesome questions and keeping me on my toes and being so involved. Thank you so much.
Thank
Okay,
you.
well, thanks again.
Thank you
Have a
for
good
coming.
night.
Thank you very
Uh,
much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Bye.
Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.